All right. Well, on to section 5. I think the penultimate section of this chapter on the cultural matrix of inquiry. So Dewey has been using the term relation. You can see that just in the little bit that we finished, talking about different kinds of relations between meanings and terms and existences and significances and things like that. And so we're going to talk more about, specifically, about the term relation. So he says, so far the word relation has been rather indiscriminately employed. The discussion has now reached a point where it is necessary to deal with the ambiguity of the word as it is used not merely in ordinary speech, but in logical texts. So we're going to deal with the ambiguity of the term, of the word relation. The word relation is used to cover three very different matters, which in the interest of a coherent logical doctrine must be discriminated. So number one, symbols are related directly to one another, right? We talk about symbols being related. So we might relate the word, there's an example that I'll maybe use, might relate the word smoke to fog, right? As having a similar kind of meaning in some way. Number two, so symbols are related to existence by the mediating intervention of existential operations. So we use words to, right, refer to existing things, and that reference is an operational thing. It happens through what we do, through our acting on the world, in kind of respect to the language we use about the world. And then number three, existences are related to one another in the evidential sign signified function. So the existences, things, right? Objects that we can perceive in the world, stuff that we perceive in the world, those things are related to one another in the evidential sign signified function. So a cloud, right, a dark cloud can signify rain, and those are two things in the world. We don't need to verbalize it. We don't need to see it in terms of words. We can see a dark cloud and have the anticipation of rain. And so that's another kind of relation, right? It's different than relating the words cloud and rain, or the words cloud and fog, or something like that. Or the words smoke and fog, and right, other example. So that these three modes of relation are different from another, and that the use of one and the same words tends to cover up the difference and thereby create doctrinal confusion is evident. And yeah, I see a bit of this confusion in kind of early 20th, late 19th century writings, which is kind of the context that Dewey is thinking about. For example, the philosopher F.H. Bradley wrote a lot about relations, and it's not always clear. He seems to kind of slide back and forth between thinking about terms as related to each other and things in the world as related to each other. And it's not always clear what he's talking about, or if he's talking about them in the same way or in different ways, and it gets very, very confusing. And so I think this is an important distinction to try to bring into that sort of discussion where you're talking about relations. Relations, a very big philosophical topic. There's books about the concept of relations, and some of this discussion can be clarified by making a distinction between relations between symbols and existential things, and relations between the existential things themselves. Going on. In order to avoid negatively the disastrous doctrinal confusion that arises from the ambiguity of the word relation, And in order to possess positively linguistic means of making clear the logical nature of the different subject matters under discussion, I shall reserve the word relation to designate the kind of relation which symbol meanings bear. So which symbol meanings bear to one another as symbol meanings. So relation, when he talks about relations, he's talking about the relation of symbol to symbol, right? The relation of the word smoke to the word fog or the word smog. I shall use the term reference to designate the kind of relation they sustain to existence. For example, the relation of the term cloud to an actual object, cloud you might perceive, or some other kind of cloud-like thing that you may be directing someone's attention to. So that would be reference. And the word connection and involvement to designate that kind of relation sustained by things to one another in virtue of which inference is possible. So clouds might have a connection to rain, might be involved in rain in some way, and therefore we make an inference. If we see a cloud, we have an inference that a certain kind of cloud, a dark cloud, whatever, we have an inference that rain will be perceivable at some point in the near future. So that's connection, right? The differences, when pointed out, should be so obvious as hardly to require illustration. Consider, however, propositions of mathematical physics. So 1, as propositions, they form a system of related symbol meanings that may be considered and developed as such. So you can have, within mathematical physics, you can have discourse about, well, not about, but you can have, discourse that's potentially about physical things in the world, physical processes, but you can develop it just in speech or writing, right? You develop physical ideas, the ideas of physics. You explore them, develop potential hypotheses about how those ideas are related to existence, but you don't need to observe anything at that point. You can just explore the system of physical symbols, physics-based symbols, right? And then number 2, but as propositions of physics, not of mere mathematics, they have reference to existence, a reference which is realized in operations of application. So those propositions, you can develop them just in discourse and speech and writing, but they also have reference, potentially reference to existence. And to figure out, to kind of realize that reference, you do things, make observations, make measurements, perform experiments and that sort of thing. And that shows you whether what you are discoursing about actually refers to anything in the world. And then number 3, the final test of valid reference or applicability resides in the connections that exist among things. So you can have an idea that when you perform this experiment, this will happen, and you base that just on the meanings that you have developed just through discourse. So you form a hypothesis, but then you observe, do existential things actually have these connections, right? So you can, just to take our basic example, which is not something that would be of much interest in physics. Of course, it's some interest in physics, but you see a cloud, a dark cloud, and you infer, you discuss the dark cloud. What does the dark cloud mean? Are clouds connected to other things? What other terms could we connect clouds to? They could be connected to various aspects of the water cycle, to rain, to evaporation, to condensation, and stuff like that. And, talking about this in a hypothetical way. And then you make observations of bodies of water and evaporation and heat and pressure and all of that, and see whether these existential things, measurable things, observable things are connected together in the way that your discourse has indicated. Going on, however. Let's go on. Did I finish this last sentence here? So the final test of valid reference or applicability, of course, resides in the connections that exist among actual things. Existential involvement of things with one another alone warrants inference so as to enable further connections among things themselves to be discovered. So the involvement of clouds with rain, or with evaporation and condensation and all of that. Observations of those existential involvements and connections warrants inference that allows us to discover further connections, make hypotheses about further connections that can be observed. The question may be raised whether meaning relations in discourse arise before or after significance connections in existence. So what comes first? Meanings or significances? Do we first infer and then use the results to engage in discourse? Or do we first infer from existential things to other existential things and then use that result to discourse, to develop meanings? Or did relations of meanings instituted in discourse enable us to detect the connections in things in virtue of which some things are evidential of other things? Or did we first have these terms for things, relate the terms to each other, or develop a kind of a system of discourse in which terms are related necessarily to each other through difference and similarity? And then did the fact of this discourse allow us to observe connections among actual things in the world? The question is rhetorical in that the question of historical priority cannot be settled. So he's saying that we can't really decide which came first. I'll maybe have a comment to say about that later. The question is asked, however, in order to indicate that, in any case, ability to treat things as signs would not go far did not symbols enable us to mark and retain just the qualities of things which are the ground of inference. Without, for example, words or symbols that discriminate and hold on to the experienced qualities of sight and smell that constitute a thing smoke, thereby enabling it to serve as a sign of fire, we might react to the qualities in question in animal-like fashion and perform activities appropriate to them. But no inference could be made that was not blind and blundering. Maybe I should pause here and try to break that down a little bit. So, of course, in animals, something goes on that is like inference. I think Charles Sanders Peirce pointed this out as well a long time ago, back in the 19th century, that something goes on in the organism, in the animal, that is akin to logical inference in humans. So obviously, in that sense, significance connections come first. There's some version of significance, sign significance going on in animals, where, for example, the maybe the scent of predator or prey is a sign of that thing, even if it's not present to sight or sound, right? But the smell, they react maybe just to the smell and either go after it or run away from it or whatever. So there's a kind of implied connection of smell with a certain predator or prey. But certainly that gets developed and refined and becomes more complex in human beings, where you have language, and language lets us point out or draw attention to or maintain in attention, in consciousness, properties, special properties of things. So we may notice the particular shape and color of a cloud, right? And hold on to that using a description of the cloud. Or he talks about smoke, without, for example, words or symbols that discriminate and hold on to the experienced qualities of sight and smell that constitute a thing's smoke. So we have symbols that allow us to discriminate features of smoke. What kind of smoke is it? Where is it coming from? How much is it? How much smoke is there? So we have words that we can use to discriminate all of these things and kind of hold them in consciousness while we kind of anticipate what the significance of them are. What are the significance of these things? Does it signify a fire out of control? Does it signify a cooking fire? Does it signify something like a smoke from a smoke machine? So an animal might not be able to make these discriminations. It will just react in a more instinctive fashion, right? I think that's the basic idea. And maybe he's being a little bit too, making too much of a break, although he talks a lot about continuity. Maybe he's making too much of a break here between animal cognition and human cognition. But certainly in humans, it's, in a mature human, it would be very hard to break apart sign significance behaviors, sign significance processes, and symbol meaning based behaviors, because all those things are very tangled up, and it's hard to take out the linguistic factor out of human behavior. So anyway, let's go on. Moreover, since what is inferred, namely fire, is not present in observation, any anticipation that could be formed of it would be vague and indefinite, even supposing an anticipation could occur at all. So I think he's saying that symbols perform an important role in inference to what is not present, right? It's easier maybe to make connections among symbols than it is to infer from one existential thing to a non-present existential thing. You know, when I say smoke, you'll think fire. When I see smoke, leaving that aside, if we did not have this linguistic side to us, if we saw smoke, would we so easily make the connection to fire? I don't know. He says our inferential activity would be vague and indefinite without this linguistic component. If we compare and contrast the range and the depth of the signifying capacity of existential objects and events in a savage and a civilized group and the corresponding power of inference, we find a close correlation between it and the scope and the intimacy of the relations that obtain between symbol meanings in discourse. Let's look at that part of that again. So comparing, we call savage, let's say like pre-industrial or pre-industrialized or non-industrial groups, and maybe industrialized groups. If we're comparing these, comparing the contrast and the range and the depth of the signifying capacity of existential objects and events. So looking at what are the significances of objects and events in these two different kinds of groups, and what kinds of inferences are they each able to make, right? The corresponding power of inference, so how well are they able to make inferences from existential things? He says that we find a close correlation between this power of inference, ability of inference, and the scope and the intimacy of the relations that obtain between symbol meanings and discourse. So he's basically saying, I think, that if you had two groups, we don't need to think about one of them as savage and one as civilized, but let's take two groups. One has a better developed, more extensive language, more complex language, greater amount of and greater complexity of relations among symbols, and take another group with a simpler language. He's saying that the group that had the more complex, more developed language would have more complex, more developed, better range of inferences at its disposal. So he's saying there's a correlation, basically, between symbol use, language use, and inference from existential things to other existential things. So there's a relationship, but basically a correlation between significance and meaning. Remember, significance has to do with the connections among existential things, and meaning has to do with the relations of symbols. So he's saying there's a correlation here, which is an interesting point to think about. And I don't know what to think about that exactly. I suppose it's hard to argue with, but what is the actual it's almost like a causation correlation issue. Yes, there seems to be some correlation there. Is it a causative one? I don't know. There are other factors going on when you get to more complex societies. And both of these things, I would guess, develop. I guess they're probably not exactly. There's probably a causal relation, but also other relations. They develop as the whole culture as a whole develops, right? Anyway, that's probably too much time spent on that issue. Last sentence here. Upon the whole, then, it is language originating as a medium of communication in order to bring about deliberate cooperation and competition in conjoint activities that has conferred upon existential things their signifying or evidential power. And again, I think for humans, they confer upon existential things much of their signifying or evidential power. Certainly their evidential power, if you're thinking about it in the context of science and warranted assertions and things like that. But there's some nuance here that I feel maybe should be added. But yeah, it's a complex issue. I don't want to spend too much more time on that. Anyway, key point here is the three kinds of relations. Relations between symbols and existences, and relations between different existences. And each of those, he's going to use a different term for that, for each of those different kinds of relations. And there may be some relation between the ability of humans to infer from existence to existence and the ability to go from symbol to symbol in discourse, which is complicated. But let's end here on that note. And next section is the last part of this chapter, so see you then.